Rose Barkley's fingers closed around Carlo Gambino's silk tie, yanking his jaw down until his breath ghosted across her cheek. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice steady despite the jackhammer pulse in her throat. "Sniper. 10 o'clock. Your driver just lit you up." She pulled him into her chest, forcing his head below the sight line, her body a human shield made of white apron and desperate calculation. His hand rose slowly to her waist, protective, questioning. Then the obsidian window behind them detonated into 1,000 glittering teeth. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment to hit that like button if you love suspenseful, emotional stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter. We also want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's your city, your country, or even just your favorite spot to watch these stories, we love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's get back to the story and see just how far courage can take someone when danger is closing in. 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday that smelled like the end of something, and the Obsidian Club's entrance carried the scent of things Rose had learned not to want. Aged leather and tobacco smoke, the particular musk of cologne that cost more than her rent, the sharp mineral tang of champagne opened too fast by men who never checked the price. It was the smell of power that didn't need to announce itself, that moved through rooms like a low-frequency hum only certain people could hear. The kind of atmosphere that clung to men who made cities kneel instead of asking permission. Rose stood beside the heavy glass door she'd just opened, the cool night air raising goosebumps beneath her pressed white sleeves. Carlo Gambino paused at the threshold. Not leaving yet. Just standing there, adjusting his cufflinks with the slow precision of a man who understood that hurrying implied fear, and fear implied weakness. At 34, he carried himself with the kind of bone-deep stillness that made noise feel obscene. His scar caught the golden interior light, a thin white line from cheekbone to jaw that should have ruined the symmetry of his face, but somehow made it more dangerous. Sharp features carved from something harder than bone, dark eyes that absorbed light without reflecting it back, as if even physics knew better than to challenge him. His black hair was slicked back with the careless perfection of someone whose barber made house calls, still immaculate despite the humid night pressing against the city, like a bruise. His suit moved with him the way water moved around stone, tailored by hands that understood the architecture of intimidation. Men like him, men whose names cleared rooms and silenced laughter, men who wore violence the way other people wore wedding rings, rarely looked at the help. Rose had learned that her first shift, had learned to read the microsignals that separated the merely wealthy from the genuinely lethal, had learned which patrons came to be seen and which came to see who needed disappearing, had learned the specific flavor of danger that came with power earned through blood rather than inherited through accident. That's when she saw it. Through the glass reflection created by the warm interior lights bleeding into the rain-slick darkness, she could track the curb behind him. The driver, Lee, she'd memorized his name the same way she'd once memorized server passwords and offshore routing numbers, stood beside the black sedan with military posture. 3 years with the Gambino operation, according to the kitchen whispers that moved between sous chefs and bartenders like contraband. Right-handed. She'd clocked that during week 1 because her old life had taught her to track which hand reached for phones, which hand stayed near waistbands. Except now, in this crystallized moment, Lee was checking his watch with his left hand. Her heart kicked against her sternum like something caged and furious. The gesture was wrong. Choreographed. Not the casual glance of someone tracking minutes, but the deliberate semaphore of someone sending confirmation. A signal she'd seen deployed once before in a glass tower in Manhattan from a man whose family was being held in a basement he'd never see. Then the flash. Microscopic. nearly invisible. A pinpoint of red light dancing across Lee's polished shoes before vanishing into the wet pavement. Laser sight. Not on Carlo. On the driver himself. The spotter's acknowledgement. The sniper was locked, waiting for the head to rise into the kill box. The world tasted like copper and adrenaline. Rose's ears rang with the specific frequency of violence narrowly avoided, the kind of sound that lived in your teeth and jaw long after the danger passed. Carlo's hand was an iron band around her bicep, dragging her through the obsidian's shattered entrance with the controlled brutality of someone who'd learned to move bodies efficiently. Not rough enough to bruise, yet, but firm enough that her feet barely touched the marble as he hauled her past the frozen maitre d' and the cluster of security personnel converging on the blast site with weapons drawn. Move. His voice was arctic. A single syllable that carried the weight of executions and unmarked graves. Rose didn't fight him. Fighting would raise questions she couldn't afford to answer. Instead, she let herself be pulled through the kitchen's steel doors, past the line cooks who'd gone statue-still with the particular paralysis of people who understood that looking too closely at Carlo Gambino's business was a terminal diagnosis. The exit alarm screamed as he kicked open the service door, spilling them into the alley where rain hammered the pavement like 1,000 tiny fists. The SUV was already there, black, armored, idling with a predatory hum of something built to withstand small arms fire and shaped charges. The rear door opened before they reached it. Another bodyguard, this one young and twitchy, his hand white-knuckled on a pistol grip. Carlo threw her inside with the casual violence of someone discarding a cigarette. She landed hard against leather seats that smelled like gun oil and expensive aftershave, her apron tangling around her knees. He was inside before she could sit up, the door slamming with the final sound of a vault ceiling. The partition between them and the driver was already up, tinted so dark it looked like a wall of obsidian. Bulletproof glass, probably. The kind that turned passenger compartments into confessionals or coffins depending on who was asking the questions. The SUV lurched forward, tires screaming against wet asphalt. Rose braced herself against the door handle, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing her hands to stop shaking through sheer muscle memory from a life she'd buried. Carlo sat across from her in the rear-facing seat, perfectly still despite the vehicle's aggressive acceleration, his dark eyes fixed on her with the unblinking focus of a man who made his living reading people's tells. Blood traced a thin line down his temple from where flying glass had kissed his skin. He didn't wipe it away. Just watched her with the patience of a predator that had already run its prey to ground and was now deciding which part to eat first. Tactical signaling. His voice was quiet, conversational, which somehow made it worse. Left-hand watch check followed by laser confirmation. Spotter protocol. He tilted his head slightly, the way a surgeon might examine an unexpected tumor. How does a waitress know spotter protocol? Rose's mind raced through plausible lies. Abusive ex-military boyfriend. True crime podcast obsession. Lucky guess. Each option landed dead in her mouth before she could voice it, because the man sitting across from her had built an empire on detecting lies, and her survival now depended on threading a needle so fine it might as well be invisible. I read people. The truth, carefully edited. It's how you stay safe in service work. You learn to see things. Things. He repeated the word like it was a foreign object he was examining for explosives. You saw a compromised driver executing a military-grade ambush protocol through a reflection in a glass door while opening it for me. The way he said it made it sound like an accusation and a eulogy. That's not reading people. That's operational awareness. The SUV took a corner hard enough that Rose had to brace herself. Carlo didn't move, didn't even sway, as if gravity had agreed to special terms with him. "Who are you?" he asked, and Rose understood with sudden, terrible clarity that this wasn't a question. It was an ultimatum. The kind of crossroads where one answer led to protection and the other led to a black plastic bag and a construction site that wouldn't be excavated for 20 years. She met his eyes, those dark mirrors that gave nothing back, and made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I used to clean things," she said quietly. "Digital things. For people who needed problems to disappear without paperwork." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the rain hammering the armored roof like it was trying to warn her, trying to tell her she'd just crossed a line that had kept her alive for 5 years. Carlo leaned forward slowly, elbows on his knees, and smiled for the first time. It was the most terrifying thing she'd seen all night. "Then we need to talk about who wants me dead," he said, "and why they're willing to burn a cleaner's cover to do it." The safe house occupied the 42nd floor of a building that didn't officially exist on any city registry. Rose knew this because she'd once erased 3 shell corporations that owned similar properties, back when her job was making inconvenient architecture disappear from legal databases. The elevator had required a keycard, a thumbprint, and a retinal scan just to move, the kind of security that told you the people inside had enemies with resources and patience. The apartment was surgical in its minimalism. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered like broken glass, furniture that prioritized function over comfort, and the particular emptiness of a space that existed only for violence and its aftermath. No photographs, no books, nothing that could tell a story about who lived here or what they valued beyond survival. Carlo had disappeared into another room the moment they arrived, leaving Rose alone with 2 bodyguards who watched her with a blank professionalism of men who disposed of bodies and wouldn't lose sleep over adding hers to the count. She sat in a leather chair that faced the windows, hands folded in her lap, still wearing her waitress uniform like a costume she couldn't remove. The white apron had a small tear near the pocket from where Carlo had grabbed her, evidence of the moment her invisible life had shattered. When he returned, he'd removed his jacket and rolled his sleeves to the elbow. The blood was cleaned from his temple, revealing a thin cut that would scar. He carried 2 glasses and a bottle of something amber that caught the city lights. No label. The kind of liquor that traveled through private channels and didn't care about regulations. "You're not drinking," he said, setting both glasses on the obsidian coffee table between them. Statement, not question. "I'm thinking clearly right now." Rose kept her voice even. "Seems unwise to change that." He poured anyway, 2 fingers in each glass, then pushed one toward her before settling into the chair opposite. Close enough that she could see the scar tissue on his knuckles, the kind that came from hitting things harder than bones were designed to withstand. Far enough that he could react if she moved wrong. Professional distance. She recognized it from her old life, from meetings where trust was a currency no one could afford to spend. "Tell me about cleaning." He sipped his drink, never breaking eye contact. "Digital things. Be specific." Rose measured her words like she was defusing a bomb, because in a very real sense she was. Offshore accounts. Shell corporations. Digital footprints that needed to disappear without triggering audit flags. "I specialized in making large-scale financial operations invisible to regulatory agencies." She paused, then added the detail that would either save her or kill her. "I was very good at it." Past tense. Carlo set his glass down with the soft click of expensive crystal meeting stone. "Why?" "Because I cleaned something I shouldn't have. The truth, stripped to its bones. Made enemies I couldn't erase. Had to choose between disappearing or dying. And you chose waitressing." The skepticism in his voice was surgical, precise. "A woman with your skill set, serving drinks to men like me. Best place to hide is in plain sight." Rose met his stare, without flinching. No one looks twice at service staff. We're wallpaper, furniture. You learn things when people forget you're human. Something shifted in his expression, a micro-movement around his eyes that might have been respect or recognition. You learned about Lee. He leaned back, the leather creaking softly. 3 years with my operation. Vetted. Trusted. Family. The last word carried weight that made the room feel smaller. How did you know he was compromised? Wrong hand on the watch. Rose's training kicked in, the analytical distance that had kept her alive through corporate espionage and syndicate audits. Left-handed people don't check time with their right unless they're signaling. The laser confirmation just proved what I already knew. Carla was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way demolition experts studied buildings before deciding where to place charges. The people you're hiding from, he said finally. How badly do they want you? Badly enough to spend 5 years looking. Rose's throat tightened. Badly enough that if they know I'm alive, they'll burn everything to find me. And now you've surfaced. He poured himself another measure, the amber liquid catching light like old honey. Saved my life in front of witnesses, security cameras, and whoever Lee was reporting to. Your cover isn't just blown, it's incinerated. Rose felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of 5 years of careful invisibility collapsing into this single crystallized moment of consequence. I know. Carlo set his glass down and leaned forward, forearms on his knees, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixing with rain and cordite. I'm going to find who ordered the hit on me, he said quietly. I'm going to find who compromised Lee. And I'm going to erase them so completely that historians will think they were folklore. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the finality of contract terms. You're going to help me do it. In exchange, I'm going to make you disappear properly. New identity. New life. Resources to stay buried where even your enemies can't dig. And if I refuse? His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. You're already dead, Rose. You just haven't accepted it yet. At least this way, you get to choose how you haunt them. She looked at the untouched glass between them, at the city bleeding light through the windows, at the man who'd built an empire on calculated violence and was now offering her a lifeline made of the same material. It wasn't mercy. It was transaction. But mercy was a luxury she'd stopped believing in years ago. Rose reached for the glass and drank. The liquor burned going down, smooth and brutal, tasting like endings and beginnings ground into the same bitter truth. When do we start? She asked. They found Lee's body at dawn, dumped in a parking garage 3 blocks from the Obsidian, like a piece of discarded machinery. Carlo's phone lit up at 6:47 a.m., the vibration pulling Rose from the shallow sleep she'd managed on the safe house couch. She watched him take the call, watched his face settle into the mask of controlled fury that probably preceded most of his violence. 4th floor. Henderson's street garage. He was already moving, grabbing his jacket from the chair back, checking the pistol holstered at his spine with the muscle memory of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Throat cut. Professional. Rose stood, her waitress uniform wrinkled and wrong in the morning light bleeding through the windows. That's the message. What message? That whoever ordered the hit doesn't leave loose ends. She moved toward him, her mind already running tactical scenarios the way it used to run financial models. Lee failed. This is how they close accounts. Carlo's jaw tightened. I want to see him. Every instinct Rose had developed in 5 years of hiding screamed at her that this was wrong, that bodies didn't just appear conveniently close to recent crime scenes, that professionals who silenced drivers didn't leave them 3 blocks away like breadcrumbs. But she also understood that men like Carlo Gambino didn't build empires by ignoring their dead, that loyalty, even to traitors, demanded final accounting. Then we go carefully, she said. The garage smelled like oil and old concrete and the particular staleness of spaces where sunlight was a rumor. Lee's body occupied a parking space on the fourth floor, arranged almost respectfully against a support pillar, his eyes closed like someone had granted him the mercy of looking peaceful. Carlo's remaining bodyguards, 3 of them now, after last night's purge, formed a perimeter while he approached the corpse with the slow deliberation of someone paying last respects or making promises. Rose hung back, her eyes scanning the space with the pattern recognition software her brain had become. Exit routes, sight lines, unusual vehicles, the particular wrongness that lived in the gap between what should be there and what was. That's when she saw the phone. Tucked half under Lee's thigh, screen dark, expensive case catching the fluorescent garage lighting. Too obvious. Too staged. Like someone wanted it found, wanted it examined, wanted. Don't touch anything. Her voice cracked across the space like a whip. Carlo froze, his hand inches from Lee's collar. What? The phone. Rose was already backing toward the stairwell, her body moving on autopilot, on the same survival instinct that had kept her alive through corporate hits and regulatory ambushes. It's wrong. Lee wouldn't have his phone. They would have taken it, wiped it, destroyed it. Unless. The explosion answered before she could finish. Not the phone. The car. A black sedan 3 spaces over that Rose's subconscious had flagged as wrong. Too clean, too new, parked at an angle that suggested hurried placement rather than casual parking. The blast wave hit like a physical wall, a concussive force that turned air into something solid and violent. Rose felt herself lifted, thrown, the world rotating in that strange slow-motion clarity that accompanied catastrophic violence. She hit the concrete and rolled, her waitress training taking over. How to fall carrying trays, how to protect your head, how to absorb impact without breaking. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that lived in her chest and skull, followed by the rain of debris and the specific chemical taste of military-grade explosives. Smoke filled the floor like a living thing, thick and black and toxic. Rose's ears screamed with tinnitus, her vision swimming. She forced herself to move, forced her body to respond despite the shock trying to shut her down. Carlo. She had to find Carlo. Through the smoke, she could make out shapes. A bodyguard, not moving. Another, crawling toward the stairwell. Fire licking up from the sedan's wreckage, hungry and growing. And there, Carlo, on his knees, blood streaming from his nose, trying to stand with the stubborn determination of someone who'd survived worse. Rose grabbed his arm. Move. Now. My men are dead or dying, and we will be too if we don't move. Her voice was pure command now, stripped of deference and fear. This was her expertise, the part of her that had navigated corporate wars and syndicate purges. The bomb was designed to collapse the floor. We have maybe 90 seconds before the structural supports fail. She could already hear it, the groaning of stressed concrete, the cracking of rebar, the particular sound of a building deciding to stop fighting gravity. Carlo's eyes cleared, found hers through the smoke, and something passed between them. Trust. Terrible, absolute trust born from necessity. Rose pulled him toward the stairwell, navigating by memory and the emergency lighting that flickered through the haze. The floor shuddered beneath them, a sick rolling motion that felt like the earth deciding to swallow them. Behind them, the section where Lee's body had been arranged simply ceased to exist, collapsing into the level below with a sound of the world ending. They hit the stairwell as the fourth floor gave way completely, the door slamming shut on a wall of dust and smoke and the screaming of metal. Carlo collapsed against the wall, breathing hard, his expensive suit ruined with concrete dust and blood. One of his bodyguards had made it, the youngest one, clutching a dislocated shoulder but alive. Rose leaned against the railing, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. Through the window, she could see emergency vehicles converging, lights painting the morning red and blue. "That wasn't about killing you," she said quietly. "That was about sending a message." Carlo wiped blood from his face with the back of his hand. "What message?" "That they know I'm with you now." Rose met his eyes, saw her own fear reflected back. "And they're willing to burn the entire city to get to us both." The new safe house was deeper underground than the last, a bunker carved into the city's forgotten infrastructure, where subway tunnels met Cold War paranoia. No windows, no natural light, just concrete walls, industrial lighting, and the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat. Carlo's people had swept it twice for devices, but Rose still felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical surveillance. She sat at a steel table that looked like it belonged in an interrogation room, a laptop open in front of her that Carlo had produced from somewhere along with a change of clothes, black jeans, a soft gray sweater that smelled like expensive detergent. Her waitress uniform was gone, burned probably, along with the last physical remnants of the woman she'd pretended to be. Carlo stood across from her, arms crossed, his ruined suit replaced with dark tactical gear that made him look less like a businessman and more like what he actually was. A weapon with a pulse. The cut on his temple had been bandaged, but blood had seeped through, a dark stain that matched the expression in his eyes. The shadow files. He said it like he was testing the words for poison. "I've heard the name. Ghost story in certain circles. Financial records that could collapse governments and syndicates alike. Disappeared 5 years ago during a federal investigation."
His jaw tightened.
"You're telling me you're the reason they vanished?" Rose's fingers rested on the laptop's keyboard, not typing, just touching the keys like a pianist remembering a concerto she'd sworn never to play again. "I didn't delete them for justice or ideology," she said quietly. "I deleted them because I was paid to. $3 million, routed through 17 shell accounts, and the promise that after the job I'd be untouchable. Obviously, that didn't work out."
"No."
The word tasted like ash. "Because what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the person who hired me was eliminating witnesses. Everyone connected to those files started dying. The analyst who'd compiled them. The auditor who'd discovered the discrepancies. The lawyer who'd been preparing to present them to a grand jury." She met his eyes, let him see the weight she'd been carrying. "I survived because I went underground before they could find me. Changed everything. New name, new face, new life." Carlo moved around the table slowly, predator circling prey, except Rose wasn't sure anymore who was hunting whom. The shadow files documented what, exactly? A joint operation between corrupt intelligence officials and organized crime. Rose pulled up a window on the laptop, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of her old life. Money laundering on a scale that would make cartels jealous. Weapons trafficking. Human assets being traded like commodities. The files proved that certain government agencies weren't fighting the underworld. They were partnering with it, taking cuts, facilitating operations in exchange for political leverage. She pulled up a directory tree from a backup she kept hidden in encrypted fragments across the dark web, insurance she'd hoped never to need. These were the key players 5 years ago. Names populated the screen like tombstones. Senator Michael Voss, Deputy Director Patricia Chen, and coordinating the whole operation, she highlighted a name at the center of the web. Carlo leaned in, his breath ghosting across her shoulder. "Marcus Huang. You know him. He's my underboss." Carlo's voice had gone flat, emotionless, the tone of someone watching their empire crack in real time. Second in command. Handles the sole New York shipping routes. I've trusted him for 8 years. Rose felt the pieces clicking into place with the terrible inevitability of a gun being loaded. The sniper. Lee's betrayal. The bomb. She turned to face him, close enough to see the fury building behind his controlled exterior. They weren't trying to kill you. They were trying to eliminate you before you discovered what they're building. Which is a coup. Rose pulled up another file, financial records she'd reconstructed from fragments and forensic analysis. Your shipping routes are the perfect infrastructure for what they were doing 5 years ago. Anonymous cargo. International waters. Diplomatic immunity for certain containers. Marcus has been positioning himself to take over your operation, but not for power, for access. He's rebuilding the network I destroyed. Carlo's hand came down on the table hard enough to make the laptop jump. And you just happened to be at the Obsidian when they made their move.
No.
Rose's throat tightened. I chose the Obsidian specifically because it was yours. I've been watching Marcus for 3 months, ever since I recognized him in a news photo at a charity gala. I knew if I could get close to your operation, I could figure out what he was planning. She paused, then delivered the truth that had been eating her alive. I took the job as your waitress because I was trying to stop this before it started. Before anyone else died. The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the ventilation system cycling, could hear Carlo's breathing as he processed the magnitude of what she'd just confessed. You used me, he said finally. I was trying to protect you. Rose stood, met his fury without flinching. The people Marcus works for don't just kill their enemies. They erase them. Families, associates, anyone who might remember they existed. If he'd succeeded last night, you wouldn't have just died. You would have been the scapegoat for everything they're planning. Every body, every dollar, every crime would have been pinned on the dead Korean crime lord who went out in a blaze of glory. Carlo's jaw worked, muscles jumping beneath skin as he fought for control. How many people know you're alive? As of yesterday? Just you and whoever Marcus reports to. Rose wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the bunker's climate control. As of today, after that bombing, probably every intelligence agency with a satellite feed. Then we're both dead. Not yet. Rose turned back to the laptop, pulled up a secure chat interface that looked like it belonged in a spy thriller. Because I still have access to something they don't know exists. A backdoor into their current financial network. I built redundancies into everything I cleaned, insurance policies in case I ever needed leverage. Her fingers flew across the keys. Marcus thinks he's untouchable. That his government partners will protect him. That your death will give him everything he needs. She hit enter. Watch lines of code scroll past like digital warfare in real time. We're going to prove him wrong. Carlo leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel his heat, smell the copper tang of blood and concrete dust still clinging to him.
How?
Rose's smile was sharp enough to cut. By making him as dead as he thinks we are. Financially, politically, operationally, every way that matters. She pulled up another screen showing accounts, connections, vulnerabilities. And then, when he's got nothing left to protect himself with, we're going to make him face the same choice he gave all those people 5 years ago. Which choice? Disappear, Rose said quietly, or die trying. The dress cost more than Rose had made in 6 months of waitressing. Midnight blue silk that clung like water and moved like smoke, cut low enough to suggest vulnerability, while the structural boning whispered armor. Carlo's stylist had transformed her in 4 hours, hair swept up to expose her neck, makeup that made her eyes look dangerous, jewelry that was actually concealed surveillance equipment disguised as diamonds. She looked like the kind of woman who belonged on a crime lord's arm, the kind whose beauty was a weapon as deliberate as any gun. Stop fidgeting. Carlo's voice was low as their town car pulled up to the Harper Hotel, where the annual benefactors gala drew the city's most dangerous elite under the pretense of charity. His hand settled on her knee, warm through the silk, steadying. "You look perfect. I look like bait," Rose murmured, but she stopped adjusting the thin strap of her dress, where the micro camera was embedded. "You look like mine." The possessiveness in his tone wasn't real, just part of the performance they'd rehearsed, but it sent heat down her spine anyway. "Remember, Marcus will expect me to bring someone new after last week. Everyone knows about the obsidian attack. Showing up with a beautiful woman proves I'm not hiding, not afraid." Rose took a breath that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with stepping back into a world she'd fled. "And when he approaches, let him." Carlo's jaw tightened. "He'll want to assess the threat, figure out who you are, what you know. That's when you get close." The ballroom was obscene in its elegance. Crystal chandeliers that cost more than houses, ice sculptures melting slowly into champagne fountains, and a particular atmosphere of wealth so vast it had become abstract. Rose recognized faces from financial news and federal watch lists, politicians and power brokers who'd never see the inside of a courtroom because justice bent around men like them the way space bent around black holes. Carlo's hand pressed against the small of her back as they entered, guiding her through the crowd with the possessive ease of ownership. People noticed. Eyes tracked them, conversations paused mid-sentence, and Rose felt the weight of being seen after 5 years of invisibility. It was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. There. Carlo's breath ghosted against her ear, intimate enough that anyone watching would assume pillow talk. 11 o'clock. Gray suit. Marcus Huang looked like someone's favorite uncle. Warm smile, expensive glasses, the kind of face that suggested kindness and confidence. He was talking to a senator Rose recognized from the shadow files, both men laughing at something that probably involved other people suffering. Nothing about him screamed monster, which was exactly what made him dangerous. They moved through the room like chess pieces, Carlo working the crowd with calculated precision, each conversation bringing them closer to Marcus's orbit. Rose played her part, the beautiful mystery, the new acquisition, laughing at the right moments and staying silent at others, her hand never leaving Carlo's arm. She could feel eyes on her, assessments being made, rumors already spreading about who she might be. Marcus approached during the 7th song, when they were standing near the bar. "Carlo." His voice carried genuine warmth, or a perfect simulation of it. "I heard about the obsidian. Glad to see you're still standing. Takes more than bad luck to put me down." Carlo's smile was all teeth. "Marcus, this is Rose." "Rose, my underboss, Marcus Huang." Rose extended her hand, channeling every debutante and society wife she'd ever watched from the edges of rooms like this. "Mr. Huang, Carlos told me so much about you." Marcus took her hand, held it a fraction too long, his eyes doing the assessment she'd anticipated. Looking for threat, for weakness, for whatever made her worth Carlo's protection. "All good things, I hope." His smile never reached his eyes. "You're brave, being seen with him so soon after the incident." "I don't scare easily." Rose withdrew her hand slowly, let her fingers trail across his palm in a gesture that could be read as flirtation or challenge. The micro-contact was enough. The RFID chip embedded under her manicured nail had already cloned his phone's near-field signature. Clearly. Marcus shifted his attention back to Carlo, but Rose could feel him tracking her in his peripheral vision. "We should talk about security protocols. After what happened." "Later." Carlo cut him off with the casual authority of someone who owned the conversation. Tonight I'm just here to remind everyone I'm not dead. His hand tightened on Rose's waist. And to enjoy the company. They moved away before Marcus could object, Carlo guiding her toward the terrace, where the music was softer and the air didn't taste like money and malice. Rose waited until they were alone, until the only witnesses were the city lights bleeding up from below, before she spoke. Got it. His phone just connected to mine. The keylogger's installing now. Carlo's shoulders dropped half an inch, tension releasing. How long until you have access? 12 minutes if his security is standard. Longer if he's paranoid. Rose pulled out her own phone, hidden in a clutch that matched her dress, watching lines of code scroll past. Once it's in, I'll have everything. Texts, emails, call logs, GPS data. Rose. Carlo's voice stopped her. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between respect and something more dangerous. You're really good at this. I know. She turned back to the ballroom visible through the glass doors, to Marcus laughing with another politician, to the world of beautiful monsters wearing beautiful masks. I've always been good at being invisible, at seeing what people want to hide. She met Carlo's eyes in the reflection. The difference now is I'm not hiding anymore. No, he agreed quietly. Now you're hunting. Inside her clutch, her phone vibrated. The keylogger had finished installing. Marcus Huang's entire digital life was now bleeding into her system, every secret and lie and transaction laid bare. Rose smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, it felt like her own face. Now we see what monsters look like when you skin them. The assassin came at 3 a.m. when exhaustion made people careless and shadows became conspiracy. Rose was deep in Marcus's stolen data, her eyes burning from hours of screen time, when she heard the sound that didn't belong, the whisper of a window seal breaking in the apartment's eastern bedroom. Not wind. Not the building settling. The specific frequency of someone who knew how to move through spaces that weren't supposed to be penetrated. She was out of her chair before conscious thought could catch up, muscle memory from her corporate espionage days taking over. Carlo was in the next room, asleep for the first time in 72 hours, his body finally surrendering to the debt of adrenaline and violence. Rose moved toward his door, her hand already reaching for the panic button on her watch when the bedroom door exploded inward. The assassin was small, efficient, dressed in black tactical gear that swallowed light. Rose caught a glimpse of cold eyes above a balaclava before the gun came up, suppressor already attached, aimed at the center of her chest. Time crystallized into that terrible clarity where you could count heartbeats and know exactly how many you had left. Carlo hit the assassin from the side like a freight train, all controlled violence and desperate speed. They went down together, a tangle of limbs and brutal physics. The suppressed pistol coughed twice, bullets punching into the floor where Rose had been standing, and then it was chaos, fists and elbows, and the wet sound of impact on flesh. Rose scrambled for the gun that had skittered across the hardwood, her hands shaking but her training solid. She had it aimed before her brain caught up to her body, finger on the trigger, watching Carlo and the assassin roll across broken glass from the shattered door. The assassin was good, professional. Got a knee into Carlo's ribs hard enough that Rose heard something crack, followed it with an elbow that snapped his head back. But Carlo was something else entirely, a man who'd survived by being more vicious than his enemies, more willing to endure pain if it meant delivering worse. His hand found the assassin's throat, squeezed with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly how much pressure it took to collapse a trachea. The assassin's hand came up with a blade, carbon fiber, and ugly purpose, driving toward Carlo's kidney. Rose fired. The suppressed round caught the assassin in the shoulder, spinning them away from Carlo, and the knife clattered across the floor like a death sentence deferred. Carlo finished it with his hands, quick and brutal and necessary, then collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. Blood soaked through his white undershirt, spreading like a blooming rose across his ribs where the blade had kissed him anyway, too fast for Rose to stop, shallow but bleeding. "You're hit." Rose was already moving, dropping the gun, grabbing the first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet with hands that had steadied now that the immediate threat was past. "Sit down before you pass out." "I'm fine." But he wasn't moving, wasn't standing, just leaning against the wall with his eyes closed and his hand pressed against the wound. Rose pulled him toward the couch. Not gentle but not rough, the way you handled someone whose pride was wounded worse than their body. "Shut up and let me work." She peeled his shirt away from the cut, assessing with the clinical distance she'd learned in another life. 3 inches, not deep. Missed anything vital. "You'll live." Comforting bedside manner. His voice was tight with pain he wouldn't admit to. "I'm not a nurse." Rose opened the kit, pulled out antiseptic and gauze and surgical tape. "I'm the person keeping you alive long enough to get revenge." She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with steady hands while Carlo's breathing gradually evened out. The cut wasn't as bad as it looked, but it was close enough to have been fatal that her hands shook slightly when she wasn't concentrating. Close enough that she'd come within seconds of watching him die protecting her. "Why did you do that?" The question came out quieter than she'd intended. "You could have let them take the shot. Could have stayed down." Carlo's hand came up to cover hers where she was taping the bandage, stilling her movement. "You know why." Rose looked up, met his eyes, and found something there that made her chest tight. Not just gratitude or professional respect. Something rawer, more dangerous. "Carlo, you saved my life at the Obsidian." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it felt like violence of a different kind.
"At the garage."
"Tonight. How many times do I have to return the favor before you understand?" "Understand what?" "That you're not just an asset. Not just a tool I'm using to destroy Marcus." His other hand came up to her face, cupping her jaw with a tenderness that seemed impossible from hands that had just killed someone. "You're..." Rose kissed him before he could finish, before the words could make this real and complicated and something they couldn't take back. It was desperate and necessary and tasted like blood and adrenaline and 5 years of not being touched by someone who saw her instead of through her. Carlo's hand tightened in her hair, pulling her closer, and for a moment the apartment disappeared. The dead assassin, the conspiracy, the digital warfare they were waging, all of it burned away in the heat of finally admitting what had been building since she'd grabbed his tie and pulled him out of a sniper's kill zone. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Rose rested her forehead against his. "This is a terrible idea." "The worst," Carlo agreed, but his hand was still tangled in her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw like he was memorizing it. "We're both probably going to die in the next 48 hours. Probably." Rose pulled back just enough to see his face, to see the man behind the monster reputation, the person who'd chosen to protect her when logic said he should have walked away. "Then we'd better make it count." She kissed him again, slower this time, deliberate, and Carlo pulled her into his lap with careful hands that minded his wounded ribs. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to stain the sky the color of blood and possibility, and somewhere in the city Marcus Huang's phone was feeding them every secret he'd tried to keep buried. But in this moment, in this apartment filled with violence and the aftermath of survival, Rose let herself have something she'd thought was dead, the feeling of being wanted not for what she could do, but for who she was beneath all the carefully constructed armor. "We should move the body," she murmured against his mouth. "In a minute," Carlo said, and kissed her like they had all the time in the world instead of a countdown to war. The plan was simple in the way that catastrophes often were: create enough chaos that no one noticed the real attack until it was too late. Carlo would hit Marcus's private warehouse on the waterfront, the one that officially didn't exist in any corporate registry, but housed enough illegal weapons to start a small war. While Marcus's security forces converged on the physical threat, Rose would slip into the digital vault and dismantle everything he'd built. Simple. Except the part where they could both die. Rose sat in the back of a surveillance van 3 blocks from the warehouse, surrounded by screens showing feeds from Carlo's body camera and the drones his tech team had positioned around the perimeter. Her laptop was open, fingers hovering over keys, waiting for the moment when Marcus's attention would be completely consumed by survival. Through the main screen, she watched Carlo and 6 of his most loyal operators approach the warehouse. No stealth, no subtlety. Just a black SUV that rolled up to the main entrance like they owned it, because for the next 15 minutes, they would. The explosion came at 11:47 p.m., a shaped charge that turned the warehouse's steel door into abstract art. Carlo moved through the smoke like a ghost, weapon up, his team flowing behind him with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. Rose watched his camera feed as he cleared the first room, 3 guards down before they could reach their weapons, professional and brutal. Her phone lit up with an alert. Marcus's phone had just connected to his secure network, authenticating from his penthouse across the city. He was watching the same warehouse feed she was, watching his operation burn, and that meant his security protocols were engaged. Rose's fingers flew across the keyboard, her old training taking over. The backdoor she'd planted through the keylogger opened like a surgical incision, giving her access to Marcus's network infrastructure. Not the public-facing systems, but the dark architecture beneath, the offshore accounts, the encrypted communications, the digital paper trail that connected him to senators and intelligence officials and bodies that had never been found. On the main screen, Carlo's team encountered heavy resistance. Automatic weapons fire lit up the warehouse interior like a strobe, and Rose forced herself not to watch, not to think about the bandaged wound under his tactical vest or the way he'd kissed her this morning like it might be the last time. She dove deeper into the network, past the first 3 layers of security that were designed to detect intrusion. But Rose wasn't intruding. She was navigating using Marcus's own credentials, moving through his digital empire like she belonged there. Because 5 years ago, she'd built systems exactly like this. She knew where the tripwires were, because she'd invented the concept. The vault materialized on her screen, a black site server farm housed somewhere in Southeast Asia, triple redundant and encrypted with military-grade algorithms. Inside were the records Marcus had been rebuilding. Every transaction, every compromised official, every body and every dollar that tied the underworld to the government machinery that was supposed to be hunting it. Rose cracked her knuckles and got to work. The first thing she did was copy everything. 50 terabytes of evidence flooding into distributed storage nodes she'd prepared across the dark web, fragmented and redundant, impossible to fully erase even if Marcus realized what was happening. Insurance. Ammunition. The kind of documentation that could topple administrations and send men in expensive suits to supermax facilities for the rest of their lives. Then she started the demolition. Not deletion, that was amateur. Rose wasn't erasing the data, she was poisoning it. Changing account numbers by single digits. Altering timestamps. Swapping transaction amounts. Making it so that when Marcus tried to access his empire, he'd find a house of mirrors where nothing was quite what it seemed. His offshore accounts would route to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. His encrypted communications would carbon copy to journalists she'd identified as having the integrity to publish. His carefully maintained network of corruption would eat itself from the inside. On the main screen, Carlo emerged from the warehouse, his vest scorched but intact, his team down 2 men but moving. The warehouse was a pillar of flame behind them, black smoke rising into the night sky like a funeral pyre. Rose's phone erupted with notifications. Marcus's system was having a stroke, hemorrhaging data and credibility. His security team would be screaming at him that they were under attack, that someone was inside the network, but by then it would be too late. She typed the final command and paused, her finger hovering over the enter key. This was the nuclear option, the thing she'd sworn she'd never do again. A script that would simultaneously expose every file she'd just copied to law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. Federal prosecutors. Interpol. The International Criminal Court. Simultaneous sunrise that would illuminate every shadow Marcus and his partners had been hiding in. Carlo's voice crackled through her earpiece. Rose. Status. Almost done. Her voice was steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. 30 seconds. We're blown. Marcus knows someone's in his system. He's sending people to your location. Rose looked at the enter key, at the countdown timer showing she had maybe 3 minutes before Marcus's hunters converged on the van. 3 minutes to finish this or run. 3 minutes to choose between survival and justice. She pressed enter. The upload began, a progress bar crawling across her screen with agonizing slowness. 73 seconds to completion. Rose grabbed a flash drive from the console, copying the most damning files, the ones that proved Marcus had ordered the deaths 5 years ago, the ones that connected him directly to federal officials who'd sworn oaths they'd been violating for profit. Gunfire erupted somewhere close. Not on Carlo's feed. Here, in her location. The van's driver was already moving, tires screaming as they pulled away from the curb. Rose braced herself against the equipment rack, watching the progress bar tick upward with the sluggish inevitability of justice delayed. 85%.
90.
The van took a corner hard enough that she had to grab the laptop to keep it from sliding. 95%. Glass shattered, the rear window exploding inward. The driver accelerated, and Rose hunched over the keyboard, protecting the upload with her body. 100%. Across 3 continents, in offices that were just beginning their morning routines, the evidence started flooding in. Undeniable. Unimpeachable. The kind of documentation that ended careers and started prison sentences measured in decades. Rose ripped the flash drive free, closed the laptop, and grabbed the burner phone. She texted Carlo a single word. Done. His response came back immediately. Rendezvous point.
Now.
Rose looked at the burning warehouse visible through the van's windshield, at the city that had harbored monsters for so long they'd forgotten what daylight felt like. Marcus Huang was finished. His partners were finished. The empire they'd built on bodies and betrayal was collapsing in real time. But the war wasn't over yet. Not until she and Carlo made it out alive. The rendezvous point was a condemned hotel on the city's eastern edge, a corpse of architecture that urban planners had forgotten and criminals occasionally remembered. Rose arrived first, the surveillance van abandoned 3 blocks away, her laptop clutched against her chest like a shield. Carlo's team was supposed to be here. Extraction vehicles. Safe passage to the airport, and then somewhere warm where extradition treaties were suggestions rather than laws. Instead, she found Marcus Huang waiting in the lobby. He stood beneath a chandelier that had lost most of its crystals, surrounded by 8 men with the kind of weapons that turned cover into decoration. His suit was still immaculate despite the digital empire burning around him, and his smile was the saddest thing Rose had ever seen. Rose Barkley. He said her real name, the one she'd buried, and it felt like he'd slapped her. Or should I call you Rachel Morrison? Jennifer Chin? You've had so many names I've lost count. Rose's hand moved toward the pistol tucked into her waistband, but 3 reds, immediately painted her chest. Laser sights. Professional shooters who wouldn't miss at this range. Don't. Marcus's voice carried genuine regret. I actually admire you. What you did 5 years ago was extraordinary. What you did tonight was— He paused, pulled out his phone, looked at the screen that was probably showing him the collapse of everything he'd built. Apocalyptic. Where's Carlo? Rose kept her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat.
Coming.
I've ensured that. Marcus pocketed his phone. This needed to be all of us.
Clean.
Final. The sound of an engine cut through the silence, followed by the screech of tires on broken pavement. Carlo's SUV crashed through the hotel's glass entrance, not slowing, just pure kinetic violence. Marcus's men scattered, firing wildly, but Carlo was already out, moving with the focused brutality of someone who'd stopped pretending to be civilized. Rose dropped, rolling behind a marble pillar as gunfire turned the lobby into a percussion symphony of ricochets and breaking stone. She pulled her own weapon, took 2 shots that dropped a gunman moving on Carlo's flank, then focused on what she did best. The laptop was open, fingers flying across keys, connecting to the hotel's ancient Wi-Fi that someone had left running like a ghost. Marcus's phone was still active, still connected. One last vulnerability. Rose dove into it, past his frantic attempts to lock her out, and found what she needed, the kill switch he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. A digital dead man's switch that would erase all evidence, trigger cryptocurrency transfers to numbered accounts, scatter the proof across 1,000 fragmented nodes that would take years to reassemble. She corrupted it, changed a single line of code so that instead of scattering evidence, it would consolidate everything into a single package and deliver it directly to the FBI's Cyber Crimes Division. His insurance policy became his confession. Through the chaos, Rose watched Carlo move. This wasn't the controlled man she'd kissed this morning. This was the monster everyone whispered about, the reason people lowered their voices when they said his name. He moved through Marcus's men like a scalpel through flesh, efficient, brutal, unstoppable. Disarmed one with a movement too fast to follow, used the captured weapon to drop 2 more, transitioned to hand-to-hand combat with the ease of someone who'd been doing this since violence was the only language he understood. Marcus pulled his own weapon, aimed at Carlo's back, and Rose fired. The shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, his gun clattering across the floor. Carlo was on him before he could recover, one hand around his throat, lifting him against the wall with the casual strength of absolute fury. You tried to kill her. Carlo's voice was barely recognizable, something primal and ancient and soaked in the promise of pain. You sent an assassin to my home. You made her a target. Marcus clawed at Carlo's hand, gasping, his face turning colors that humans weren't meant to achieve. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Carlo tightened his grip. You're a traitor. You compromised Lee. You partnered with people who kill cleaners and call it policy. You thought you could use my empire to rebuild your broken kingdom. His scar caught the emergency lighting bleeding through broken windows, making him look carved from something harder than stone. You forgot what I am when someone threatens what's mine. Rose stood, walked to them, her laptop still open in one hand. Carlo, wait. He didn't release Marcus, didn't even look at her, but his hand stopped tightening. He needs to see. Rose turned the laptop screen toward Marcus, showed him the evidence upload completing, showed him federal agents already moving on his partners, showed him his entire carefully constructed network collapsing in real time. He needs to understand what losing looks like before he dies. Marcus's eyes went wide, watching his empire dissolve into arrest warrants and asset seizures and prison sentences that would outlive him. Watching everything he'd killed for become nothing. Please, he managed to choke out. No. Carlo's voice was final as a closing grave.
You don't get mercy.
You get justice delivered by the people you tried to erase. He looked at Rose then, and she saw the question in his eyes. Permission.
Choice.
The acknowledgement that this moment belonged to both of them. Rose closed her laptop, held Marcus's gaze, and nodded once. Carlo's hand moved with surgical precision, and Marcus Huang stopped being a threat. The silence that followed was absolute. Carlo released the body, let it crumple to the floor, and turned to Rose with eyes that were slowly returning to something human. Blood spattered his face, his hands, his tactical vest, but when he reached for her, his touch was gentle. It's over. His voice was rough, exhausted, carrying the weight of 8 years of loyalty betrayed. Rose leaned into him, felt his arms come around her, solid and real and alive. Not quite. She pulled back enough to show him her phone, the confirmation messages flooding in from law enforcement agencies. But close. Outside, sirens were beginning to wail, converging on the warehouse fire and the hotel and the dozen other locations where Marcus's network was being dismantled by people with badges and warrants. The sun was rising, painting the broken lobby in shades of gold and blood. Carlo kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth, like he was making sure she was real. We need to go. I know. Rose took his hand, bloody and brutal, and the safest thing she'd felt in 5 years. Let's disappear properly this time. They walked out of the hotel together, leaving Marcus's body and the old world behind, stepping into the dawn of something that looked almost like freedom. 6 months later, Rose stood on a beach that didn't exist on any tourist map, watching the ocean perform its endless negotiation with the shore. The sand was white enough to hurt her eyes, the water so clear she could see fish moving like rumors beneath the surface. Behind her, a small house painted the color of sea foam sat nestled against palm trees that swayed with a particular laziness of things that had never known urgency. She'd stopped checking the news 3 weeks ago, once the last of Marcus's partners had been sentenced and the intelligence officials had resigned in disgrace that smelled like plea bargains and witness protection. The shadow files were public now, dissected by journalists and prosecutors and historians who would spend decades unraveling the web of corruption that had nearly consumed them both. Rose's name, all of her names, had been redacted from the official reports, a courtesy arranged by Carlo through channels she decided not to examine too closely. The FBI had wanted to interview her. So had Interpol. Several ambitious federal prosecutors had subpoenaed someone they thought was Rose Barkley, only to find the address led to an empty apartment and a lease signed with credentials that dissolved under scrutiny, like sugar and water. She disappeared properly this time, using 5 years of planning and Carlo's resources to become someone the world couldn't find even if it remembered to look. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps crunching in the sand with the careful cadence of someone who'd learned that rushing invited violence. Carlo emerged from the tree line carrying 2 bottles of beer, condensation running down the glass like small surrenders to the heat. He'd changed in 6 months, lost the edge that had made him look like he was constantly calculating who needed to die, gained something that looked almost like peace. The scar on his cheek had faded to a thin white line that she traced sometimes in the dark, mapping the geography of his violence like a tourist learning a new language. His hair was longer now, no longer slicked back with military precision, just falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more human, less like the monster everyone had feared. Thinking about going back. He handed her a beer, his shoulder brushing hers as he settled into the sand beside her. God, no. Rose took a long drink, the beer cold and perfect, and tasting like the exact opposite of mahogany and blood money and expensive tobacco. Just remembering what it felt like. The obsidian. The fear. Trying to stay invisible. Carlo was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes tracking the horizon where sky met water in a seam so perfect it looked drawn by committee. Do you miss it? The work. Being that person. Rose considered the question with the honesty they'd earned through shared violence and survival. Sometimes. The same way you miss a war after it's over. Not the terror, but the clarity. Knowing exactly who you were, because you were the only thing standing between someone and oblivion. She looked at him, at the man who dismantled an empire to protect her. Do you miss it?
No.
The answer was immediate, certain. I miss the people I lost.
Lee.
The men who died in the warehouse. But the life, he shook his head. That was never living. That was just surviving with better furniture. Rose leaned against him, felt his arm come around her shoulders with the easy intimacy of 6 months learning to trust that no one was aiming at their heads. What do we do now? Whatever we want. Carlo's smile was small but real, the kind that had taken him 34 years and countless bodies to learn. That's the thing about burning everything down. You get to choose what grows in the ashes. They sat in silence, watching the sun complete its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that looked like hope if you squinted. Rose had spent 5 years afraid that someone would recognize her, expose her, drag her back to answer for the things she'd cleaned. Now the only people who knew who she'd been were either dead or in prison, and the woman she was becoming had no history, no debt, no invisible chains tying her to the past. Carlo stood eventually, brushing sand from his linen pants. No suits anymore, no tactical gear, just clothes designed for comfort rather than intimidation. He reached down, offered his hand, and pulled her up with the easy strength of someone who no longer needed to prove anything.
Come on, he said.
Dinner's probably burning. Rose laughed, a sound that still felt foreign but was getting easier with practice. You were supposed to be watching it. I got distracted. He pulled her close, kissed her with the slow deliberation of someone who'd finally learned that tenderness was a kind of strength. By this woman I know. She's dangerous. Former corporate assassin. Destroyed a criminal empire. Makes terrible coffee. The coffee isn't that bad. Rose kissed him back, tasting salt and beer, and 6 months of learning what it meant to choose someone rather than being chosen by circumstance. They walked up the beach together, bare feet in wet sand, leaving footprints that the tide would erase before morning. Behind them, the ocean continued its endless work, and ahead, the small house glowed with warm light that spilled onto the deck where dinner was, in fact, beginning to smoke. Carlo paused at the stairs, his hand still wrapped in hers, and for a moment she saw him consider it. The tie that wasn't there anymore, the silk armor he'd worn for years, the uniform of a life they'd both abandoned. He smiled, really smiled, the expression transforming his face into something she was still learning to recognize as happiness. No regrets, he asked. Rose looked at the house they'd built from nothing, at the life they were learning to live without looking over their shoulders, at the man who'd chosen to leave an empire behind for the possibility of something real. She thought about the obsidian, about the nights spent invisible and afraid, about the moment she'd grabbed his tie and changed both their trajectories forever. Not a single one, she said. They climbed the stairs together, and if somewhere in a city they'd left behind people were still whispering about the crime lord who'd vanished and the waitress who'd brought down a dynasty, neither of them was listening anymore. The only sound was waves against shore, dinner sizzling on the stove, and the particular quiet of 2 people who'd survived the kind of violence that usually left bodies rather than second chances. Carlo released her hand to rescue dinner, but not before pressing a kiss to her temple, gentle and permanent as a promise. Rose leaned against the doorframe, watching him move through their kitchen with the same focused attention he'd once applied to warfare, and felt something she'd thought was dead 5 years ago stirring in her chest.
Hope.
Ordinary and radical, and tasting like salt air and burned fish and tomorrow. The obsidian was ash. The monsters were caged. And Rose Barkley, or whoever she was now, was finally, impossibly, beautifully free. And that's where we leave them, on a beach that doesn't exist on any map, finally free from the shadows that hunted them for so long. Rose grabbed Carlo's tie in a moment of desperate courage, never knowing that single act would destroy an empire, expose a conspiracy, and give them both a second chance at life. From invisible waitress to the woman who brought down a criminal dynasty, she proved that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones no one bothers to see. What started with a sniper's crosshairs ended with burned fish and bare feet in the sand. Not every love story begins with saving someone's life, but the best ones? They end with choosing each other when the smoke finally clears. If this story grabbed you the way Rose grabbed that silk tie, if you felt every explosion, every kiss, every moment of desperate survival, do me a favor. Smash that like button. It tells YouTube that stories like this, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, deserve to be heard. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have grabbed the tie? Would you have risked everything to save a stranger, knowing it would destroy the life you'd spent 5 years building? I want to know what you would have done in Rose's position. And if you're hungry for more stories about dangerous women, complicated men, and the kind of love that's forged in fire and sealed with violence, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because we're just getting started. Tomorrow, we've got another story that'll keep you up at night. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is reach out and pull someone out of the kill zone, even when every instinct tells you to stay invisible. Stay dangerous, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.